morning, ladies and emperors. I just got back from Venice, and boy, are my arms tired.
The camera was rolling. Gig Young, cast as the drunken gunslinger known as the Waco Kid, opened his mouth to deliver his first line of the movie, and instead of words, he began to vomit. Within minutes he was on his way to a hospital, and Mel Brooks was standing at a payphone outside the soundstage, dialing a number he hoped would save his film. That single afternoon in 1973, on the first day of shooting Blazing Saddles, tells you more about the real Mel Brooks than any tidy list of actors he supposedly hated ever could. The true story isn't about grudges. It's about a director who spent 60 years building his career out of chaos, and who occasionally had to fight, beg, and improvise his way through disasters that had nothing to do with talent and everything to do with circumstance. Start with Richard Pryor, because Brooks himself has never stopped talking about him. When Brooks began assembling the writing team for Blazing Saddles in the early 1970s, he brought in a young lawyer named Andrew Bergman, a dentist-turned-writer named Alan Ugger, another newcomer named Norman Steinberg, and Pryor, who was then in the middle of reinventing his comedy from a polished, Bill Cosby-style act into something rawer and more dangerous. Pryor didn't just contribute jokes. He helped shape the entire moral architecture of the film, pushing Brooks to make the satire of American racism sharper and less comfortable than anyone in Hollywood was used to. Brooks has said publicly, including in a 2022 interview with NPR to promote his memoir All About Me, My Remarkable Life in Show Business, that he wanted Pryor to play the lead role of Bart, the black sheriff who rides into a bigoted frontier town and turns it upside down. The part was written with Pryor's voice in mind. But Warner Brothers refused. According to Brooks, studio executives told him they could not get insurance on Pryor because of his drug arrests and his reputation for unpredictability. Biographer Scott Saul, in his 2014 book Becoming Richard Pryor, documents the same refusal, noting that Pryor had recently gone through a cocaine-fueled breakdown on another film set, and that word of it had clearly reached the studio. Brooks has described being furious, even threatening to walk away from the project entirely. In the end, the role went to Cleavon Little, a Broadway actor Brooks did not know well but grew to admire. Brooks has said many times since that Blazing Saddles would not exist in the form audiences know without Pryor's fingerprints all over the script, even though Pryor's face never appeared on screen. There was no hatred in that story. There was heartbreak, and a decision that was never really Brooks's to make. The chaos didn't stop there. Gig Young's collapse on the first day of filming was not a personality clash either. It was a medical emergency dressed up as a scheduling nightmare. Brooks had cast Young believing the actor, a real-life alcoholic, was in stable recovery. He was not. Film historian Patrick McGilligan, author of the 2019 biography Funny Man, Mel Brooks, has explained in interviews, including one with Wisconsin Public Radio in 2025, that Young was actually suffering from alcohol withdrawal on set, and that the violent illness that overtook him mid-scene sent him to the hospital and effectively ended his time on the picture. Brooks did not have the luxury of anger. He had a half-built movie and no leading man for one of its two central roles. So he did what he had done for most of his career. He called an old friend. Gene Wilder, who had already worked with Brooks on The Producers, picked up the phone, listened to the emergency, and agreed to fly out and take over the role of the Waco Kid on essentially no notice. It is one of the more remarkable rescue stories in modern film history, and it is entirely true, verified by multiple biographers and by Brooks's own recollections over the decades. Far from resentment, what grew out of that crisis was one of the defining creative partnerships of Brooks's career, one that produced Young Frankenstein the very same year. It's worth pausing here, because this is where the popular myth of Mel Brooks the grudge holder falls apart completely. If you actually read what Brooks has said about the people who challenged him most, you find something closer to reverence than resentment. Take Cloris Leachman, who played the unforgettable Frau Blucher in Young Frankenstein, the character whose very name sends horses into a screaming panic every time it's spoken. In interviews given over the years, including a 2009 conversation with Terry Gross on NPR's Fresh Air, Leachman described walking onto set with almost no idea how to build a German accent or find the character, and asking everyone around her for help, including, by her own account, Brooks's own mother. What emerged was a performance so committed that co-star Gene Wilder reportedly broke character and burst out laughing multiple times during her scenes, not because she was difficult, but because she refused to break first. Brooks has spoken about her total immersion in interviews for decades, once explaining that Leachman never stepped out of the role even between takes, greeting people in character because she had, in his words, given herself entirely to the part. That is not a description of an actor a director hated. That is a description of an actor who terrified her director in the best possible way, by being better and stranger than he expected. The same is true of Gene Hackman's single brief appearance in Young Frankenstein, as the blind hermit who unknowingly torments the monster with soup and cigars. Hackman came to the project almost by accident. He had told Gene Wilder he wanted to try comedy, and Wilder brought the request to Brooks, who was reportedly stunned that a serious dramatic actor, one who had already won an Academy Award for The French Connection, wanted anything to do with a low-budget, black-and-white spoof. Brooks has since called the moment one of the most memorable surprises of his career, and has praised Hackman's total commitment to the role, noting that Hackman played the scene with such sincerity that many viewers still don't realize it's him. There is no documented feud here, no clash of egos. There is simply a director who built his reputation on unpredictability, working with actors whose intensity sometimes outpaced his own, and coming away from it with some of the most quoted scenes in American comedy. Madeline Kahn belongs in this story too, though not for the reasons internet clickbait usually claims. Kahn worked with Brooks on Blazing Saddles, Young Frankenstein, and High Anxiety, and by every documented account, Brooks adored her without reservation, once calling her one of the most talented people who ever lived. But their process together was famously exacting, and that exactness is well documented in William V. Madison's biography Madeline Kahn, Being the Music, A Life. According to Madison, when Brooks asked Kahn to sing her show-stopping number I'm Tired as Lily von Stupp, he told her to harmonize the way Marlene Dietrich would have, and Kahn responded by finding a deliberately imperfect note in the middle of the song, a small, strange choice that became one of the most memorable moments in the film. It was Kahn, according to Madison, who pointed out that the song needed an introduction the script hadn't written yet, and Brooks went home that night and wrote one from scratch. That is not friction born of dislike. That is two serious artists pushing each other toward something neither could have built alone, the kind of demanding back and forth that looks, from the outside, like tension, and feels, from the inside, like the best kind of collaboration. So where does the idea of a hate list actually come from? It comes from something. Brooks has talked about honestly, and it deserves to be told honestly too, the difference between the myth of effortless comedy and the reality of how hard it actually is to make. Brooks has never hidden how brutal filmmaking could be behind the scenes. Blazing Saddles alone survived a fired lead actor, a studio that tried to have Brooks himself removed from directing his own script, and executives at Warner Brothers who, according to Brooks, hated the finished film so much in its first screening that they considered burying it entirely. It was only after Brooks arranged a second screening for the studio's own employees, ordinary people who laughed until the film could not be shelved, that Warner Brothers agreed to release it. None of that chaos was about actors he despised. It was about an industry that frequently did not trust his instincts, and a director who had to fight for nearly every choice that history now remembers as genius. What Brooks has actually said, across his memoir and dozens of interviews over the decades, is something more honest and more interesting than any invented list of enemies. He has described directing as an act of controlled chaos, one that depends on actors willing to bring their full, sometimes exhausting selves to the work. The people who challenged him hardest, whether through circumstances beyond anyone's control, through total artistic immersion, or through a studio system that saw risk where Brooks saw genius, were often the very people who made his films unforgettable. Richard Pryor never got to play the role written for him, and it remains one of the great what-ifs of comedy history. Gig Young's collapse nearly derailed a classic before it began, and instead delivered Gene Wilder into one of his signature roles. Cloris Leachman and Gene Hackman didn't fight Brooks. They disappeared so completely into characters that they occasionally left their own director laughing at his own set. There is also something worth saying about why stories like the invented 6 actors he hated spread so easily in the first place. Brooks has always talked about his own career with a comedian's exaggeration, calling directing impossible, calling actors maddening, calling entire productions disasters, even when the results were classics. That style of storytelling, self-deprecating, theatrical, a little larger than life, is part of what makes him such a beloved interview subject. But it also makes him easy to misquote, easy to turn into a punchline generator for lists that were never based on anything he actually said. The real Mel Brooks, the one documented across decades of interviews, biographies, and his own memoir, tells a far more human story than any invented feud could. He is a director who lost the actor he wanted most for Blazing Saddles to a studio's fear rather than his own judgment. He is a filmmaker who watched a production nearly collapse on its first day and rebuilt it with a phone call to a friend. He is a collaborator who pushed brilliant, demanding performers like Madeline Kahn, Cloris Leachman, and Gene Hackman to give him more than they thought they had, and who spoke about every one of them, decades later, with something closer to awe than resentment. At 99 years old, Mel Brooks remains one of the last living links to a version of Hollywood that no longer exists, one built on handshake deals, chaotic writers' rooms, and directors willing to bet everything on instinct. The real stories behind his films aren't about actors he hated. They're about a man who never stopped fighting for the people and the ideas he believed in, even when the industry around him, and sometimes fate itself, said no. That fight, more than any punchline, might be the most honest legacy Mel Brooks leaves behind. It's a legacy built not on grudges but on gratitude, the kind that only comes from knowing exactly how close it all came to falling apart, and how many people it took to hold it together.